Hey everyone, we've made it to one of my favorite sections, DOM events. So this is where things start to get real. This is where we can actually make cool applications that do things instead of just running code to, change the color when the page loads or change the color of something when you type it into the console. We need to understand those fundamentals, selecting and manipulating, but we have one missing piece, which is events. Events allow us to run that code to create a new element or to remove an element or to change a color when a specific interaction happens from a user. And there are tons and tons of different events out there. This is a small sampling of some of the events that we can work with in our browser. If we take a look at any modern website these days, there are JavaScript events everywhere. Here's an example. I was just using this website, caniuse.com, a couple videos ago. And let's see, there's a hover event. When I mouse over something, we get a pop-up. That's done via JavaScript. We've got click events. When I click, I'm loading new content, or at least showing and hiding different tabs. We've got other events like, let's see, if I come up to the top, as I start typing, I'll get new search results. How about color? There we go, a whole bunch of new search results. That's all happening through JavaScript. So just on this one page, I have events when I'm typing. That causes some code to run. I can type something invalid like that, or I can type, transform and get results showing up. I've got hovers, I've got clicks. I'm sure there are others that I'm skipping. And then here's another example. I just signed up for a Trello account in a throwaway email, and it does a little tutorial for me. It wants me to make my first board. So I'm going to type a name in here. My first Trello board will be my life goals. And notice what's happening as I type. Something is changing over here. That is DOM manipulation. As I hit these keys, every time I type a single character, this element that's over here, whatever it is, a span, a paragraph, an H3, who knows, it's being updated. Maybe its inner text is changing. I'll click. That click is an event. So is this one to go back. I'll go forward though. And here's more of the same. I can change some titles of these default lists. Things to do, I add my exclamation points over here and it's updated here. So there's an event. As I type, something is happening over here. My interaction is triggering something. And more of the same, I guess. I can add some titles here. Things to do in my life. I would like to explore the ocean in submarine. Okay. What else would I like to do? I would also like to release an album. Okay. I can hit enter, by the way, which is a different event. I can click to move forward, or I can just hit enter, and now I moved a step forward. All right, then over here, let's see, I've got some other things I can add to my checklist. I'm just going to do some gibberish here, and I'm ready to get started. So those are all click events and typing events, but now we've got other events. I can drag to reorder things. This is an event in JavaScript. It's actually a couple different things. There's dragging, there's dropping, there's when I mouse over, when I drag over something. Notice how I get those, like the shadow, I guess, the little gray background showing me where I would be dropping this. I've also got drag and drop within, I think. Do I? Oh, I think I just deleted one. Let's undo that. Let's try this again. How do I reorder? There we go. I can move these around. I can click. That's an event. Click again to undo. I'm sure there are other events I'm missing, but already we've seen dragging, dropping, hovering, clicking, typing. All of these are events that we can listen for, and there are way more. This is a small sampling of some of the more common ones. I've tried to group them. On the left side, we have things that are definitely more common. On the right side, somewhat common. So we can listen for clicks in our JavaScript and run some code when somebody clicks. We can do something when someone drags or drops or hovers or scrolls. That's a pretty common one. When you scroll on a web page, sometimes there will be like an animation that triggers when you scroll to a certain position. We have events for forms being submitted, key presses, focus and blur. So focus is when you're in an input like this. It's focused right now. And if I click away, it's blurred. We can run code in those scenarios. And actually right there, we're seeing that happen live. If I go to edit it, notice that I get all this stuff over here. I've got this grayed out background. And then when the input loses focus, all of that goes away. So there's some code that says when that input loses focus, when the user clicks away, then hide all of that extra stuff or change the colors or whatever happened. We've also got mouse wheel events. I don't think I've ever worked with one of those, but they are available. Double click, not as common. Then we have copying and pasting. I've maybe used them a couple times, but these allow you to run specific code when a user copies something or pastes something into an input, for example. We have events for when audio starts playing or audio stops playing, or when audio initially loads, when it completes its load. We've got screen resize events, even printing events. I've never used these, but there are two events, one called before print and after print. I think that's what they're called. When a user goes to print a website and open up that print dialog, before it opens, there's an event that we can tap into and run code. And after the user clicks the print button, I guess, there's another event that we can listen for. I've never used them, but they exist. If you go to MDN, there's a page called Event Reference, and this contains all of the different names of the events in JavaScript that we can work with, and they're grouped together. So we have mouse events, when a user clicks or double clicks, when they mouse down, which is when you depress the key or depress the mouse button, but you don't have to release, versus a click is a full click, down and up. We have mouse leave, so that's when a mouse leaves an element that it was hovering over. We've also got things for dragging and dropping. You can see there's quite a few. Drag, drag end, drag enter, drag start. We have things for media, not as common, at least in most of the apps that I do. We have, audio. What do we have? Play. Playback has begun on a piece of media. Is playing. When the playback rate has changed. When a user has seeked forward. When they've skipped forward or backwards. Volume change events. Time update. Okay, I'm not even sure what that one does. The time indicated by current time attribute has been updated. All right, I'm sure there's a use for that. We have things like progress events, storage events, update events, value change events, and further up, we've got view events, when a user goes to full screen mode, scroll events, resizing, printing, which I mentioned, kind of obscure stuff. We've got animation events, when an animation starts, focus and blur, network events. There's just so many of them, and you're never going to use all of them. Well, I'm sure somebody has, but it will be pretty difficult to use all of them. I'm going to focus on the most important ones, but the great news is I'm going to show you the pattern you follow where you can use any of these events with just one method. It's actually pretty straightforward. So we've got a lot to talk about here, but it's honestly just one method that we're going to cover after the very next video. So I'll see you then in like 5 seconds if it autoplays. I'll see you then. All right, so we've established that there are tons and tons of different events we can work with in our JavaScript code. They range from super common things like clicks and drags and hovers, scrolls, key presses, to some pretty obscure events like a printing event, or a before print, or an after print, or even a mouse wheel. They all follow the same pattern. So even though the triggers of the event are different, whether it's a user typing the key enter or return versus the user hovering or dragging or dropping, the triggers are different, but the way we incorporate these events into our code follows the same pattern. We essentially have a thing, we'll call it the thing, that we're listening for an event on. We're listening to see when this event occurs on a given thing or with a given thing, like a click on a button, a drag of an image. Then we have the event itself, so the event type. I'll call that event type. And then we tell JavaScript, here is the code I want you to run, the code to run. This is all extremely unofficial language, but as an example, we might have a single button. We want to listen or wait for a click on that button, and then when a user clicks that button, we could change the color. We could have a text input, and when a user hits return or types return, what do we want to do? We have some code that we want to run. It could be something as simple as clearing the input, or it could be get search results, where we're working with an API or a database. We could have an image as the thing, and the event would be a hover, which is actually called a mouse over. When you mouse over a particular image, we want to display the image caption. Or we want to make the color image turn black and white as a nice little visual effect. But they all follow this pattern. We have to find a thing, an element, an event type, and then code we want to run when that event actually happens. So there are multiple ways, there are 3 different syntaxes I'll show you for how we can actually achieve this. But I'm telling you right up front, 2 of them you should probably not use. But I'm going to show them to you because they are simple, but you'll also see them in bad tutorials. You'll see them sometimes, you'll see them on the docs, they have to talk about it. But then we'll see the third and the best option for how we can achieve this, how we can add events or event listeners to elements in the next video. So let's take a look at a very simple type of an event, a click. And we need to start by adding something to click on. Right now, I guess we could listen for a click on the body, but let's not do that. Let's add in a button or 2. So we'll have a button that says click me. Let's also put in a, how about a form with an input of type range. So a range input, and we'll give it a min of 10, a max of 50. Okay, so we have at least 2 things that we can now listen for clicks on. And the first syntax I'll show you involves actually putting our code right in the element, which is not a good idea. For the same reason, it's not a good idea to add a bunch of inline styles. You end up with super cluttered HTML. Your JavaScript is spread out all over the place, or in the case of style, your CSS is spread out all over the place. It's not in a centralized CSS file or a style sheet. Same thing with JavaScript. We don't want to do this, but I'm just going to show it to you. To run code, when we click on this button, we can add an attribute called onClick. And then we need to write some code in here, something as simple as an alert, you clicked me. Notice we're having to write our JavaScript in a string, which is bizarre to begin with, especially if you have to worry about quotes. Here I had to use single quotes. This is a very simple one-liner, but it's pretty gross already. Normally what you would see if you were to take this seriously and actually use inline events like I'm doing here, you would write a function and call the function from right here, but still it's not worth doing. But let's make sure it works. If I refresh my page, I'll zoom in a bit so we can see a bit better, and I will click. There we go, you clicked me. All right, so that's our first event interaction that we have going on. We added an event listener to the button, and we said when a click occurs, run this code. And if I have another button without the onClick, just so we're very clear here, nothing happens. So we're not adding that to every button. We're simply registering an event listener for this one button that does this one thing when it is clicked, as you can see there. If I added a onClick to my second button, you clicked me too, and I refresh the page. This one gives me one alert, you clicked me. This one gives me a different alert, you clicked me too. So they have nothing to do with one another, other than the fact that they're both buttons. And we can also add an onClick to something else, like this input. onClick equals, will alert, why don't we console.log instead? Console.log clicked the input. Okay, once again, I have to pay attention to my quotes, which is obnoxious. We'll refresh the page. What happens when I click on this? There you go. I'm getting clicked the input. Very fancy stuff. We also have other events, as I mentioned, back in our JavaScript file. Oh, I deleted my little table here. Right now, we are doing one event type, which is click, but we have other event types that we can work with. You can see them all here. So we're doing onClick. The event name is just click. We have other events, and if we want to use them inline, like we're doing right now, we preface them with on. So what's another one with a mouse? So here are some other mouse events. Why don't we try mouse over? So mouse over right here, it fires when we move our mouse over a particular element. In order to make that work, we need to change this either from onClick and adapt it to be on mouse over, or we could add a second attribute. We could have an onClick and an on mouse over. But let's see what happens when I mouse over this. There we go. Mouse over, you can see it's working. Very annoying to have an alert so often, especially just from a hover. All of these follow this pattern, on and then the event name equals do something. Okay, so this is the first example of something that I recommend you never do. Adding these inline event handlers, it clutters your markup. It's really hard to keep organized and to understand where everything is coming from. You just don't want to put all that JavaScript directly into your elements. So instead, there's another way of doing this where we select an element first in JavaScript, and then we can add an on-click or an on-mouse-over. So I'll keep one of these. Let's get rid of, I'll keep both of them, I guess. I'll add a new button here. And this button will have an ID, so I can select it. We'll call this clicker. And the text will just be clicker. All right, now let's go to our JavaScript file, which I've included here as a script at the bottom. And I'm going to start by selecting that button. Document, I could do get element by ID. I could do query selector. I'll do query selector. The ID was clicker. And I'll save that to a variable. btn, button, clicker, whatever we want to call it. And why don't we go take a look in our console here. If I look at btn, console.dir btn, I want to see all the properties. Open it up, scroll down, and you've probably noticed this before. All of these on properties, on mouse over, on selection change, on click, these now probably make a bit more sense. These are properties we can set inline, which we've already done, or we can add them in. We can set a function as a value in our JavaScript. So if we select the first button with that horrible mouse over event, we'll do document.querySelector button and just get the first one, save that to a variable, const first btn, and we do our console.dir first btn, open it up. If we find our on mouse over, there it is. Notice it's not null. It has a value, and that's coming from our HTML. So this is one way of adding in one of those event handlers. This is one way of saying, this is what I want to happen on mouse over. But we can also do it through JavaScript. We just set that same property. So btn dot, let's do onClick first. And then we need to set it to a function or give it something. If instead we just wrote alert right here, alert hi, what do you think will happen? Let's try refreshing our page. I get alert hi right away. So why does that happen? Remember that JavaScript is just going to go through this code and encounter this. We'll say, all right, we're going to update the property on click, set it equal to the result of executing alert hi. So it runs this line, and whatever alert returns, which I'm pretty sure is just undefined, alert hi or h, what do we get back? Undefined. So then it sets on click to undefined. When we do it in our inline HTML, it seems deceiving, but what happens is that the DOM is just going to take this string, turn it into JavaScript, but wrap it in a function so that it only runs when you actually mouse over or you on click. So if we want to make this work through JavaScript, we need to write a function. We could do a regular function expression. Function, we don't have to even give it a name. And in here, we could say alert or console.log. Let's do a console.log. You clicked me, go away. All of them are basically saying the same thing. You clicked me, click the input. It doesn't matter. This is still not the way you want to be doing this. Remember, this is educational, but this is not the approach that we want to take. So btn.onClick equals this function. We're saying the button that we selected, that's the thing, when the click happens or a click happens on that button, not just anywhere, but on this one button, this is the code to run. It will execute this function. So let's try it out. Refresh the page, click on my button, there we go. You clicked me, go away. And I could instead change this to a different type of event, or I could add a second event listener to that same element. So we have on click. What about double click? Is it double or is it DBL? Okay, it is DBL click. I don't know if I've ever used that, but we can just look it up if we ever need it. So on DBL click, let's go double click as our console.log. Refresh the page. Here's a single click, and a double click. Okay, so we now have two different events that we're listening for on the same button. And it follows this exact same pattern. We select something, we select the event, and if we're doing it with these on properties, it's on and then the event name. On click, on double click, but we'll soon see a much better way in the very next video that makes it easier. We don't have to keep track of all of these different property names. We use one method. So that's kind of it for this video. Two different ways of adding events, both of which are kind of frowned upon and I'm not recommending, but it's a good introduction. So we could do it inline in our HTML using the exact same names. So on some event, all lowercase, which is also very confusing. I don't know why it's all lowercase, but it is. Everything else in JavaScript is camel-cased. So on mouse over, on click, on key press, which we'll take a look at some key press events later on. Then in your JavaScript, you could also instead set the property by first selecting an element, adding in the on click or the on double click or the on mouse over, and setting it equal to a function. And that function will execute when the event occurs. All right, so in the last video, we saw that we could add an event listener by using an on click or on some attribute inline, which I said I'm not a fan of because I don't like writing JavaScript in a string in our HTML. And then we also saw that we could do it in our JavaScript by selecting an element, I'll call it L, I haven't actually selected it, and then setting the on click property or the on mouse over or on double click property, whatever the name of the property is, on something. And I also mentioned this is not great in my opinion either, but I didn't go into a ton of detail why. I'm going to show you quickly why it's not great, and then we'll see the alternative, which is called add event listener. So if we add in something to select, a simple button, we'll do a button, click me, and then select it over here. So document.querySelector button, save it to a variable, and I set the on click to be some function, nice and simple. We'll console.log, you clicked me. All right, so this is review. It should work unless I mess up any syntax here. Let's refresh the page, and it does work. Now, if I wanted to have a second click listener, I don't have that option with what we've seen. With onClick, it's a single property. Just like if we have some object, const thing equals this object. If I set thing.color equal to purple, if I try and change thing.color and set it equal to some other, it could be a function. It doesn't matter. Only the most recent value is there. I don't have purple anymore. It's a property, and we're doing the same thing here. So if I were to add another click listener, button.onClick equals function, this time we'll console.log second time. Let's try it. All we get is second time. I'm not getting the first event listener, or this function is not running because we overwrote that property. Now it seems stupid to do two different console.logs based off of a click, but there are times when you might want different listeners or multiple functions to run on a given event. Sometimes you want them to run dynamically, so you may not have both of these functions running every single time something is clicked, but you could have it turned on and off, if that makes sense. So it's possible you could have more than one handler running for a given event. Now that doesn't work with the two options we've seen, but we have a third option, which I've been hinting at a lot. It's called add event listener. Now, add event listener is great because, for one thing, it's one method, and it will attach any type of event listener you want. A click, a double click, what do you call it? A mouse wheel scroll, that's not the official term, a drag, a mouse over, any of them, a print, a before print, if for some reason you needed that event. And also, it will attach as many as we want to a given element. So if we want to use it, we select our element, and then we call the add event listener method. We have it on all elements that we can select. So I have my button I've selected. I call button.addEventListener, and if I hover, but there's over 100 different options here. You can see it's been condensed. It says 81 more or 91 more. So what I can do is pass in one of those event names. Now I don't pass in onClick. I pass in click, and instead of on mouse over, I would pass in mouse over as a string. So let's do click, start there. And then I have a second argument, which is a function. And this function will execute when this event occurs. So I'll do an alert, clicked, and save. Let's check it out. I click the button, and we get our alert. I could add a second event listener if I wanted to the exact same button, also listening for a click, and I'll console.log second thing. Let's see what happens. So we get our alert, and I get second thing printed out. So what we're doing here is not setting the onClick property. If we actually look at button over here, button.onClick, it's not set to anything. We are attaching an event listener, which we can have multiple of for a given event on a given element. So I could attach as many as I want. It's probably uncommon to do that, at least to do multiple clicks. So let's try a different type of event. How about a, what should we do? A mouse over. So button.add event listener, mouse over. Again, not on mouse over, which is the name of the property we could set, but mouse over. And a function. And you can do an arrow function, although I'll show you times or a situation where you wouldn't want to use an arrow function. It has to do with the keyword this, but we're not there yet. When this happens, why don't we change the inner text of the button? So button.innerText equals stop touching me. And save. Let me zoom in for you. There we go. Now, as soon as I leave, it still stays because I'm just listening for the mouse over and I'm permanently changing the inner text. Fortunately, we have another event we could attach, which is a mouse out. So mouse out, and I'll change the text back to, what did we have originally? We had click me originally. So I'll do that here. Click me. And save. Let's see if it works. I hover, stop touching me, back to click me. Stop touching me, back to click me. If I click it, we get our first click function running, and the second one runs as well. Add event listener is our Swiss Army knife for events. We don't have to set individual properties. We don't do it inline. Instead, we can just use the exact same method, but we pass in the type of event we want. We can have multiple of the exact same event on one element. And then we give a callback function. This function will run when this event occurs on this button. So I've got a mouse over, a mouse out, a click, a second click. Why don't we try one more? Something that is a little different. Not a mouse event, so not a click or a mouse over, mouse out. Let's try a scroll event. When we work with scrolls, we have a couple options as far as where we attach the event to. We can listen for a scroll on the entire window. So that would be, a scroll bar over here. I don't actually have enough content to scroll. So I could quickly rectify that by adding a ton of H1s. And if I now do it, I do have a scroll bar on the right side. We could also listen for scrolls within a single element. So if you had like a text box that was very large, or an iframe, or some element that you could scroll inside of, then you could add a scroll event to that. But I'll do it on the entire window. I'll also move my button to the top so that it's easier if you are just coming to this code and trying to figure out what the heck's going on. So to add a scroll event to the window, I have access to the window. If I just open up the DevTools, I can just type window. It's the global scope, the global object in the browser in JavaScript. Window.add event listener. And the event is scroll. And then I'll add a function. And in here, why don't we just console.log stop scrolling. Same exact pattern. Select something, or in our case with window, we don't have to select it. We already have window available. And then .add event listener. What kind of event? What to do in the event of a scroll on the window. So we will refresh, and I'm going to scroll. There we go. So you probably noticed how many times this is printing out. One of the most common things to do with scrolls is to do something called throttling. You may not want to run this function every single time, the scroll event happens. It will fire if you just change your scroll position by like a single pixel. Usually, what I've seen at least is there's some position you want to scroll past, and that will trigger something, maybe an animation. If you get down to the bottom of the page, something will happen. But you normally don't want something to happen like 100 or 300 times in the course of scrolling from the top to the bottom of the page. But that's beyond what we're talking about here. All we need to know is that we can use add event listener to attach all sorts of different events. You pass in the event name and a function to be called, and that function will run when the event occurs on that given element, on the window, on a button. And also remember, not only is this nicer to write, in my opinion, one method, but we can also listen for multiple events of the same type on one element versus with our old-fashioned on-click, either inline or through JavaScript, we don't have that flexibility. So add event listener is your go-to way of adding events. Definitely 5 out of 5 stars. Recommended. Hey, welcome back. In this video, we'll make a tiny demo project using add event listener. I'm calling it the world's most annoying button. It's a button that when you try and click it, it moves out of the way, and you have to wrangle it, you have to corner it into a corner or a small space in order to actually click it and defeat it. So it'll be very simple. We have a single button element, and we'll add some text like try to click me. And that's all we need in our HTML. Then in our JavaScript, we're going to select that button and use the mouse over event. So when you get near that, as soon as you mouse over that button, it's going to move. So you can't click because it will be gone before you can click. So let's do a document.querySelector to select that button. We only have one. We'll save this to a variable called btn. And then we'll add our event listener. btn.addEventListener mouse over. And our function will start by just console.logging moused over me. And just make sure that's showing up. I always like to just test that things are connected the way they should be. So if we refresh, open up my console, I'm way zoomed in, by the way. Your button will probably look a lot smaller. Okay, moused over me, that is showing up. Okay, so now what we want to do is when you mouse over, I'd like for it to randomly move somewhere else on the screen. And there's a lot of ways of moving elements. I'm going to go with the very simplest one, which is not really ideal as far as performance. I'm going to change the style.top and style.left. Not this.style, but btn.style.top, btn.style.left. This being a JavaScript course, I don't have time to go into a bunch of complex CSS animations and optimizations, but you can check out some other courses that are online. Other people have great courses. You can check out my YouTube video on animations in CSS to understand why animating top and left and a lot of different CSS properties is not really ideal. But for this demo, it totally works fine. So I'm going to start by selecting all buttons. We only have one. I'm going to give it a position of absolute. I'll give it a top of 10 pixels and a left of 10 pixels. So now I have a top and a left set and position is absolute. I can now manipulate that inside of my function, the callback for my add event listener. So when mouse over occurs, the first time, why don't we just set btn.style.left equals, and we can just pick some number like 200 pixels, and then btn.style.top equals 100 pixels. And let's make sure it moves. So refresh the page, I hover, and it moved. Okay, so that's the first bit, relatively easy. I'm still way zoomed in, aren't I? 250%. So there we go, it's moving. Now what I'd like to do is randomly pick a number and have it move that many pixels. And ideally that number would be on screen. I don't want to just pick some random number between 0 and, 1,000, because some people might have a screen that's only 900 pixels, or they might have a really big screen with thousands of pixels. I don't want to limit it. So how do we get access to the size of the screen? This is a bit of a side topic here, but it's worth going into. There's a lot of different ways, and unfortunately, it does vary a bit according to the browser a user is in, especially older versions of browsers. But there are a couple different options I'll show you. The first is on the window. There is a property called screen. And if you look at screen, it has things like available height and available width. Now this is the maximum dimensions of my actual screen on my computer. This is not the dimensions of my browser window. If I were to shrink this or change the size of the window, we still end up with 1920 by 1200. So that is not what we want to use here, because that would assume a user had their screen or their browser window full screened. But if we're doing it in a very small window, we want to account for that as well. So we have another option. This is just one of the many options we have. If we look in window again, there's a property called inner height and another one called inner width. So right now my inner width is 818 pixels. If I resize this, here's my actual window for this browser. It's down to 203. If I bring it over here, it goes up to 1680. So we want to use inner width and inner height to calculate how many pixels, or to use to calculate where we should move this button. We'll just multiply a random number by the inner width and by the inner height, turn it into pixels. So I'll do that here. Why don't we start with math.random. We'll multiply that by window.innerHeight. And we can floor it if we want to. I think we can just use a fractional number of pixels as well in CSS. I'm actually not positive. I don't know if I've ever done that. But we'll floor it just to be safe. So this will give us a height. Let's make a variable for that. Const h. And then we'll get a width. So I'll just duplicate that. I'll call it w. Math.floor of math.random times window.inner width. Then we'll use that to set button style.left. So I'll use the width here, and I'll do a template literal. So I'll insert, I don't really like the name w. I'll just do width, height. So width, pixels, and then the same thing for button.style.top. I'll change this to height pixels. Let's test it out here. It appears to be staying on screen so far. If I shrink my window down and I refresh again, it still stays within that window size. Okay, so we have this part done. What if we add some behavior in if the user does manage to click somehow? And there is a way to do it. If you zoom way in and you make your window super tiny, you can click. So why don't we add another event listener on the button, add event listener when a user actually clicks, if they can. What should we do to reward the user? It won't be much of a reward, but let's change the inner text of the button. Button.innerText equals you got me. And then let's make the body, the background color, turn green. So to select the body, we can do document.body, and then style property, we'll do background color, not color. Camel cased equals green. And is there anything else? I guess that's good enough. We could do an alert, but I'll leave it at this. So in order to catch it and show it to you, I'll go into my CSS file and make the button a little larger. So I'll do height is maybe 50 pixels, width is 100 pixels, refresh, and I'm also going to resize my window. So if I resize this as small as I can go in Chrome and refresh, it's still going to be tricky to click. But what I'll do is zoom in, make the button really large. Okay, so now, all right, I should be able to click. Close. There we go. I got it. You got me, and it turns green. So I cheated. I made the window way smaller, and I made the button way bigger by zooming in, but it works. So this is a silly demo, but the point is that we can have multiple events on one element, and we have a mouse over, we've got a click, it's moving. So inside of this on-click, well, it's not an on-click, inside of this event handler for mouse over, we are manipulating the button. Same thing here, we're changing the inner text and the background color of the body. So this is kind of fun, silly stuff. Next, I'm going to show you how we can add event listeners to a bunch of elements. So how do we add an event listener to every comment on a page or every button on a page that should behave in a particular way? We don't have to do it one by one. So that's coming up next. Next up, a very important topic: how do we attach event listeners to multiple elements? We've seen how we can attach multiple event listeners to one element. We had a button, and that button had a click listener, a click handler, and also a mouse over. But how do we take every button on a page and add a click event handler? Or how do we take every upvote arrow on Reddit and make it do something when you click upvote versus downvote? We don't attach those manually one at a time. At least we don't hard code it. We use a loop. So here are some examples. This game we saw earlier on, each one of these cards has some event functionality. When I click, it flips. I click, it flips. When I hover, that's probably done through CSS, so it's probably not a JavaScript event, but it could be a mouse over. But each time I click, there is an event that's firing, and it pertains to each one of these cards. And there's no way, I can't imagine that they're doing this manually, where they have a variable button 1, button 2, button 3, button 4, and they're calling add event listener on every single button. That would be disastrous. Here's another example, a simple calendar widget. It's not that simple, actually. It's a good amount of code coming from CodePen, and every single day has some functionality. I can click, and stuff happens. That's about it. But we have some click functionality on every date on this calendar. So let's see how we do that. I have my blank HTML page, and rather than putting HTML here to start with, let's generate some with our JavaScript. So I'll delete what we had before, and I'm going to make just some colored boxes. You'll see why in a bit. Different colored boxes using an array of colors. We can just do the standard boring rainbow colors. Red, orange. Okay, I have an array of colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, indigo, violet. I want to loop over all of these colors and create a div on the page with that background color. So I'll do a for let color of colors. We want to create a div, so document.create element div. Save that to a variable. I'll call it box. And I'm going to do a couple things. First, I'll actually define a class called box in my CSS, and I'll give it a width of, let's start with 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and then let's create a container to insert all of our boxes in our HTML. So we'll create maybe a section, give it an ID of boxes, and that's where we'll attach all of these boxes. So we'll select that, document.querySelector, using the ID sign, boxes. We'll call this the container as the variable name. We want to make a box. We also want to assign that box.style.background color, camel cased, to be color from the loop. So the first one will be an empty div with a background of red and then orange and so on. And we'll append them to the container. So container.append child, or just regular append if you don't care about IE, append child of box. And I also have that box class, but let's see if it's showing up at all right now. If we inspect, we should see that we do have divs in there, but they have no content and they don't have a height or a width because our class is not being used. So let's add that class, box.ClassList.add box. Refresh. Hey, there's our boxes. I'm way zoomed in again. Okay, so we've got these different boxes. I'm quickly going to style them. So in my CSS, what I'm going to do is give the boxes ID, which is our container, a display of flex. If you're not familiar with Flexbox, well, we don't have time to talk about that in this video. It's a relatively easy way of positioning elements on the page and divvying up space. I'll do justified content, center, align items, center. Let's see if that works for us. Okay, awesome. So we have this going now. We have our boxes on the page. Now for the main event, how do we add a click listener to each one? Well, the most obvious answer that you probably came up with is to use a loop, and that's the right way of doing it. So we just loop over all those boxes. We add an event to, or an event listener to each one. But if we want to do something unique for each box, if I wanted to print out the color that we're clicking on, we have to add a little more code in. But let's start by adding in an event listener for each box. So we could do a separate loop. We could select all the boxes and using query selector all, loop over each box and do box.addEventListener, or we could just do it right here. As we append it or after we append it, it doesn't matter. I could do box.addEventListener. Remember, this box variable is a new div each time through. So it will reference, or it refers to, the red box we see here, and then next time around it's the orange one, then all the way down to the violet one. So box.addEventListener for click. We'll add in our function here. And why don't we just console.log clicked a box. So this is simple enough. We should get a console.log clicked a box. I'm clicking if you can't hear that. But what if I want to print out the specific color that was clicked, or do something with that color? Maybe change the background of the entire body. It's actually not that bad. In this loop, we have box. I could just access box. I could console.log box dot and then style dot background color and print that out. Let's refresh the page. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, indigo, violet. Violet, violet, indigo. Okay. Anyway, distracted here. This works. We have access to the variable box because we're inside the loop still. But here's where it gets a little trickier. Let's say that my code is getting really long and I want to break it into separate functions. I don't want to have all of this, all my logic contained in one loop. I want to break it out. Maybe this function here is 50 lines. How could I make that work? Well, if I make a separate function, let's call this function, let's do function expression. We'll go with print color equals a function. And in here, what I want to do is print out the background color. And I'll update my addEventListener to call print color like this. So box.addEventListener of click, when there's a click on that box, print color. Right now, I don't have a way to access box at all. I could pass it in, but I can't do that here because the function will execute right away if I were to pass box in. So I guess I could rewrite this as a function like this, and then call print color, and then pass in box like this. Let's see if that works. Instead of print color, we'll accept a box as a parameter and console.log box.style.background again. So I have this function that runs, and all it does is it calls print color up here. Imagine we have a lot more code. Okay, so this does work. We can pass that argument around of box, but there's another option which doesn't involve having to add a function in here. I can simply pass print color, and I'll have to change it because right now box will be completely undefined. But what is the magical keyword I can use to reference the item that has been clicked? It is this, the keyword this. So if we console.log this in print color, we don't need to pass in a box. Let's see what happens now. Red, orange, yellow. This is referring to the individual div that was clicked on. Remember that this, inside of a method, which is added on to an object, this will refer to that object. If you skipped over the section on this, I highly recommend you go back and check it out. It's not the sexiest thing ever in JavaScript, but it is important. We also could rewrite this to do something else. Instead of printing out the background color, let's either change the background color of the body, or maybe we'll add an H1 in up top. H1, say pick a color, and we'll change the color of our H1 depending on what you click on. And I'm going to give my H1 a text align of center, not text decoration, so it's aligned in the middle. And then in my JavaScript, I'll select that h1. So const h1 equals document.querySelector h1. And I'll put it in the function up top. And instead of calling this print color, we'll go with change color. We'll call change color down here. And then what we want to do is update h1.style.color to be this.style.background color. So whichever div we clicked on, we want to take the background color of that, which is what we're doing right here, get that value, and set the h1, which isn't on the page right now, there it is, set the h1 to be that color. Now change color is not defined. Let's see, change color, extra E, there we go. Let's see if it works. All right, we've got red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, indigo, violet. Awesome. So we've got this nice little color picker. Very simple. But the point that I wanted to make here is that we can add event listeners to multiple elements inside of a loop. I'm not saying that you should use this pattern here where you always need to use the keyword this, but generally inside of an event handler, like we have here, this will refer to the individual element that the event listener has been added to. So if I instead of box.addEventListener, if I instead had document.body.addEventListener, or I had a button, this will refer to whatever I'm attaching that event listener to. So let's add one to our h1 very quickly. We have our h1. I'll just select it up here now and do h1.addEventListener. And we'll listen for maybe a mouse over. No capital O, that always gets me. And we'll add in our function. Why don't we just console.log this.innerText, and we'll see what happens here. And now when I mouse over that h1, we're getting pick a color. This is referring to the h1 that the addEventListener ran on, or that we attached it to. So I'll get rid of that. We don't need to add that mouse effect, and we'll leave it at this. No pun intended, but alrighty. So we saw that we can add multiple click listeners one click listener to multiple elements. They are separate addEventListener calls. It's not like we have one event that we're listening for. We're attaching 8 or 9 or however many different colors we have. We're attaching that many event listeners. It's not like we just have one overarching event listener. We have multiple. All right. Next up, we need to talk about something called the event object. So when this function is called, let's go with the change color function. It's called when we click on a box or a user clicks on a box. We're never executing change color ourselves. It's being called for us, and it's actually passed a value. It's passed an event object. And this event object sometimes is extremely useful to have access to in our callback, in our event handler. So we have access to it. It's automatically passed every single time. We're just not capturing it. In change color, we're ignoring it. But if we were to add in a parameter here, you could call it anything. Usually you'll see E or event or EVT. Any of them is fine. I'll go with EVT. Why don't we just see what it contains? Console.log EVT. I'll refresh my page. We click on one of these, and it's an event object which contains information about the particular event. So it's a mouse event. You can see where it occurred on my screen, the screen X and screen Y. We can see what else. We have this property path, which is kind of interesting. It shows everything that we clicked on. Yes, we did click on a div with the class of box, but it was inside of a section with an ID of boxes, and that's inside the body, inside the HTML element, inside the document, inside the window. We clicked on all of those. There's things like, was the shift key depressed? The timestamp for when it happened after the page loaded. All that stuff is contained in this one object. If we instead had a different type of event listener set up, why don't we do a keyboard event, a key press or a key up, a key down. Let's add in a simple input here, or actually, let's even just do it on the body. So if you type any key while you're on this web page, let's alert the key or do something with it. So I'll select document.body.addEventListener, and we'll do a key press. We'll talk more about these events, the particular key events and form events, in the next video, but I just want to show this function. We'll work with the event object, we'll use it, and why don't we just console.log the event object. So key press on the body of the document, so anywhere on this page, if I type a key, okay, I just typed a key. I typed another one. And the reason I'm showing this key event is that often we need to know which key has been pressed, and that information is contained in the event object. We don't say key press of A or key press of Z key, we just say key press. Any key that is pressed will fire this event and call this function. So if we want to know, was it the enter key? Was it the, WASD key? Was it an arrow key? Then we use the event object, which is automatically passed in. And if we open it this time, it is a keyboard event, not a mouse event. And we have a bunch of things like key, that is a very important one, if you want to know just the basic key that was pressed. Although it doesn't always work the way you might expect. For example, if I press Shift, my event is not firing. But if I instead do Shift R, it does fire. But we'll save that for the next video. All you should know is that we have access to information about the particular key that was pressed. So R, or W, P, O, I, U, and so on. Okay, so the event object is a very useful part of working with events. If you need information about the event, whether it's what was clicked on, or what key was pressed, what time after the page loaded, where on the screen, the coordinates exactly, there's a bunch of different pieces of information you can access using that event object. Next up, let's talk more about key events. So I'm going to start by adding in a simple input, so we have something to work with here, something that we can type into. I'll give it an ID of username, give it a placeholder of username, and let's also give it a type of text. Okay. So I've got my input element. Here it is. It's a bit small, but it will work. And we're going to see that there are at least 3 different options for listening for a key press or a key down or a key up in this input. So I'm going to select it in my JavaScript. I'll do const input equals document dot query selector. We used an ID of username. And then we'll add our first event listener. So input.add event listener. Let's do key down. And we will want the event object because that object will contain information about which key in particular was pressed. But why don't we just start by ignoring it and console.logging key down. All right, so let's open up our console, refresh the page. And if I type a key in this input, I'm going to hit P. It fires. We got key down. If I type L, we get key down. What if I hit Shift? That's a key down. A number is a key down. Caps lock, that's a key down. You can't tell, but I am hitting caps lock. Tab, that's also key down. So it's not just when we're actually typing some character into the input. It could be the control key, the command key. I'm hitting command over and over and over. Anytime I press a key down, it's going to fire. And it's firing when the key is pressed down originally. If we duplicate this and add a second event listener for key up and save, we'll replace this to console.log key up. I'll refresh, I'll click. I'm going to start typing, so I'll hit the letter P. And you can see key down fires first and then key up. If I hit space, same thing, key down, then key up. If I hit the right arrow, same thing. And if I hold a key down continuously, like I'm going to hold, how about Shift? Okay, 3, 2, 1, I'm holding it, and then I'm going to release it. There we go. So key up only occurs when the release actually happens, but it also runs, just like key down, it runs for any of the potential keys I could press, whether they actually change the input or not. I could hold command, option, control, the function key. All of these are going to trigger those events, which you may or may not want. So there is a third event that we'll see input.addEventListener key press. Key press actually differs a little bit from browser to browser. If you read the docs anywhere online and check out MDN's explanation, it explains how it's supposed to work. The idea is that for something to be considered a key press, there needs to be a character showing up in this input, or a change, like space. I'll refresh the page, and just as a fun little demo, it's not fun or a demo, but instead of clicking in, if I hit tab to select the input, what do you think will show up over here? Only key up, because tab, when I'm pressing down on that, it's actually moving me into this input. It's focusing on the key down. So that tab event did not occur, or the key down event did not occur on the input, but then it focused and then I released, or that's the order that things happen in behind the scenes. So I release the tab key once I'm focused in the input. Okay, so back to key press. If I type a key like K, we get key down. Oh, I accidentally hit M as well. We get down and then press and then up. But if I type something like shift, we only get down and up. If nothing is showing up in that input, we're not considering that a key press. What about a capital letter? So shift and then T. There we go. It's hard to see because I have so much going on. But what's happening is that the key press is only occurring after I hit shift and then T, and I get this uppercase T, versus the key down and the key up are firing both for shift and for T. So those are three different options for listening to events in an input or on the body, for example. There are three different input events. They are different. Generally, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. If you are making a game, for example, and you wanted to have arrow keys to move something around, you probably would not want key press. Key press is not going to give you the impact that you want. If I click here and I hit the right arrow, I'm not getting key press at all. I'm not changing the input. But if I hit L or some character that's showing up, that key press event fires. So that's one situation where you may not want a key press. But if you want to know when something is actually changing in the input, so you don't care if a user is hitting shift, you don't care if they're hitting return, you want to know what's in the input, you could use key press instead. What's interesting about key press, interesting might be a stretch, but it's important to note that when you hit return, it actually does count as a key press. I just hit return and we got press over here, even though nothing changed in the input. If I type, clearly that's a key press. And if I hit delete, which I'll do right now, that is not considered a key press. That's just a up and down. But return is a press. So why am I showing you this? Well, a lot of the time we want to listen for specifically a return press or an enter key press, meaning that the user has typed something in and they're hitting return to submit or to finish. So if we wanted to make a very simple, I wouldn't even call it an application, but a to-do list or something, a shopping list, where we have an input. Let's do this down here. We'll add an H3 shopping list, and then we'll add in a UL that will start empty. We'll give it an ID of items, sure. And then we'll also add in an input. And it will be type equals text, ID equals, what should we call it? Add item. And we'll give it a placeholder of enter a food or something. Okay, now from our app.js, I want to select that input. So I'll do const add item input equals document.querySelector. We have an ID that we added. I think it was add item. And I'll also select that UL while we're here. Const, let's call it items UL equals document.querySelector, our good friend, ID of items. Now I'm going to add an event listener to the add item input, and I'll do an add event listener of key press. I want to listen for when a user hits return, and when they do hit return, we'll take whatever is in here. Let's say fish. I hit return, I'll clear out the input, I'll grab that information and make a new LI with that data, but only on return. So we could do it for key up or key down as well, but I'm not going to, because those fire so much more often For example, if we have shift T like that, that is 2 key downs or 2 key ups, versus if I'm using key press, I only get 1. You're not seeing it show up here, but I'm only getting a key press event when the capital T shows up. So I'm going to go with key press function, and then this part's very important. We want the event object. And we're going to start by just console.logging that event object. That object, as we saw very recently, contains the information about the event. So it should contain the key that was pressed. Here we go. We've got a keyboard event. It has a bunch of stuff, but I prefer to stick with key to keep it simple here. We also have code. That's a bigger topic we don't have to go into now. But let's see what we get. I shouldn't have closed that. When I hit enter. Key is set to enter. Okay. Also, key code, I believe, is 13 for enter. So we could use either of those. This key code is standard across all browsers. I'm pretty sure using key is also standard these days. The way I learned when I was learning this stuff was key code, but it's just so annoying to have to use a number as the key that you're typing compared to a key string. And then in here, we can simply check if event.key equals enter. If that happens, we'll add a new item to list. Otherwise, we don't need to do anything. We don't want to do anything. We just leave a user alone so they can keep typing. But if they do hit enter, we want to grab the value from that input. So what would be the easiest way to do that? Well, we have the input selected. I could also just say this.value. console.log this.value. Why don't we start there and see what happens? So I'm going to start typing in here. I need cat food. I'm going to hit enter. Hey, there we go. We've got cat food showing up. I need to get cat litter, and it shows up over here. So we'll grab that value and save it to a variable, const new item text or something equals this.value. Then we'll select our items UL, which we've actually already selected, and we want to append a new li. So let's make our new item equals document.createElement of an li. And then we'll set new item.innerText to be this new item text that we grabbed from this.value. So we extract the value, and then we create a new li. We use that value we extracted to set the inner text of that li, and then we should append it. So we have items ul dot append or append child of new item. Let's see if it works. So we have a ul down here right now. It's empty, but I'll add something in like chicken breast. There we go. We're missing one thing, which is we're not clearing this input, which is very easy to do. We can just call this dot value equals empty string. The input, which is this, add item input dot value, where we fetched or retrieved the actual value a user entered, will now set it to be empty. So every time I hit enter, awesome. Very simple example, but this is a really common pattern. Listen for an enter key or some other key and do something based off of that. So that's one example. I'll stop here. Let's just recap the difference again between key up, key down, and key press. Key up and key down are going to fire for any key that you touch at all. One will fire when you press it down. The other one doesn't fire until it's released, but it includes things like shift or arrow keys, caps lock. A key press does not. The way key press is supposed to work, which is not always the case. Sometimes there's some weirdness across browsers, but the intended use for key press is that it only fires when, in the case of an input, something actually shows up, like shift K would be one key press instead of 2 key downs or 2 key ups. It would be 1 key press. An arrow key does not count at all. Something needs to show up here, or the user hits enter, which, now that I'm looking at this, we should probably add in a quick little check and just return early if this dot value, how about if not this dot value, return. So instead of checking if this dot value is an empty string, We'll just check if it's truthy or falsy actually. And there we go, nothing happens. But if I have some stuff, it does work. But if I hit enter and there's no value, we're ignoring it, we return early. We just get out of this entire function. Awesome. Next up, we'll make a little tiny game where we have a player, a little sprite of a guy walking and a coin. We're going to move the coin somewhere randomly on the screen, and we'll use the arrow keys to make our little avatar walk and pick up the coin, at which point the coin will move somewhere else, and you'll keep moving towards the coin. I guess it's a commentary on the pursuit of wealth and never being fulfilled, and there's always a new coin to go chase. Okay, so to do this, we're going to take advantage of some of the key events we just learned. We're going to use the arrow keys to move our little avatar, and I've given you starter code. There is a folder that you can download called Coin Game Starter. It has the two images, one for the player, one for the coin. And in the app.js, it also has a function that I've given you just so that we don't have to spend too much time trying to write this logic. It's logic that will detect if two elements on the DOM, two divs or images or whatever, are overlapping. And we'll use that to figure out when the avatar has actually touched the coin, and then we can move the coin. So this is straight from, I think I found it on Stack Overflow and adapted it a tiny bit. It's just kind of annoying to type ourselves. And it's also the kind of thing that if I had to do this, I would just Google it anyway, which is what I did. So I'll be transparent about that. I didn't write this from scratch, just modified it. And what we're going to do to start is just make it so we can move our player. And I'll tell you now that to make a game, a real game that performs well, you would want to use Canvas in the browser, which we're not going to talk about, at least right now. We're going to just focus on the key events, and we'll move the player by adjusting CSS properties top and left. So I'm going to start by selecting that image, which has an ID of player. So we'll do document.get. Nope, we'll do query selector. We could do get element by ID too. We want just regular query selector. The ID is called player. Const player image, or just player equals, or how about avatar? And we also want to add an event for a key press or a key down or key up, but we don't want it to be on one of these elements. We want to be able to just press a key, like the left arrow, the up arrow, anywhere. And to do that, we can attach it to the window, and key press is not going to do what we need it to do here. In most browsers, arrow keys are not considered key presses, so we'll do key down or key up. Let's do key up for now. We'll add event listener for key up. Function, we'll use the event object, and why don't we console.log event.key. We'll refresh the page. I'll open up my console, and I'm going to hit the down arrow. There we go. Right, left, up. Cool. So we have those 4 different arrows that we want to work with. Those are the keys that we care about, event.key. And let's just take one of them. Let's start with down. So when you press down, we want to add to the image or the avatar style. So avatar.style.top. And I could just hard code it right now to be like 200 pixels. The initial CSS has top at 100, so if we set it to 200, it will move downwards. And right now I'm doing this just whenever you press any key at all. I'll refresh the page, and I'll hit down or right, and it does move down, but only the first time. Every other time, it's just being reset to 200 pixels. So this is where it gets kind of annoying if you're not using Canvas. What we need to do is figure out the current value, whether it's 200 or 100 or some other value, but this is a string. So we need to remove the pixels. We want to turn that into an actual number, like 200. Then we want to add some amount. Let's say we're adding 50 pixels. Then we want to take 250 and turn it into a string. Then we want to take that and add px and use that to update avatar.style.top. So what I'm going to do is probably make a separate function. We'll call this const extract, what do we want to call it? Extract position. And we'll pass in a string. We'll call this pause. And to use it, we would do something like this. extract pos of, and then avatar.style.top, and that will be something like 200 pixels, and we want to get 200 back from this function. So we'll start by getting rid of the px, and we can use slice to do that. If I have 200 px dot slice and I go from 0 to -2, I'll get rid of those last two characters. Even if my string is a lot longer, we'll just remove the last two. We're not actually removing it, but we're creating a new string. So we'll do that here. Pos dot slice 0, -2. And then we want to make sure that we turn this into a number. And to do that, we can do parse int. And let's just copy this over here. Let's make a variable called pos equals 350px, and then call parse int of that pos position. We get 350. If we set pos to be something larger, px, and run that again, we get a number. Okay, so we want to return this, and I think I'll just do an implicit return on a single line like that. So now we have that function extract position, and we'll save that to a variable, const current top. And then we'll just take current top, we'll add in, let's say 50, and then we want to add pixels, the string px. So what I'll do is set avatar.style.top to be current top. I'll do string interpolation here with a template literal, current top plus 50, and then px outside of those brackets. And that should do it for me. Let's see. Now this is going to fire every time I press any key. Does not seem to be working the way I'm expecting. Let's take a look. So we have our image. Let's see what avatar.style.top is. Let's console.log avatar.style.top every time I press a key. We're not getting anything. So is this returning? Avatar.style.top. Okay, so here's what's going on. I figured out our issue. Initially, on our image, the very first time it loads, we don't have an inline top set. So even though we have it set in CSS, I actually went over this in hopes of preventing these issues for you guys early on in the DOM sections, and then I completely forgot about it here. So what's going on is that avatar.style.top initially is an empty string. And when I'm trying to extract a position from that, we're getting not a number. And then every time after that, we're working with not a number, which is not working well. You might think that we could do this, give a default value. If position is not passed in, or if it's empty string or undefined, set it to be 10 pixels, we'll extract 10, or we could do 0 pixels and turn that into just 0. The problem is that if I try it out, those default parameters don't run. If I do extract position of an empty string, it doesn't work. If I passed in nothing, oh, well, we're not returning anything, so that's a problem. But if I do return something, I would get 0. But if I pass an empty string in, we still get not a number. So this default parameter won't work. What we could probably just do, it's kind of clunky, it's not that bad. Say if not position, because an empty string is still falsy, even though it won't trigger a default parameter value, we'll simply return 0. So if currently avatar.style.top is an empty string, then we'll return 0 and then use that. Okay, so that should work better for us. And then we're setting avatar.style.top using that. Let's make sure though. Double check, and I'll refresh the page, and it looks like it's working. One more time. Okay, cool. So now let's make it so it doesn't do this every single key that is ever pressed. Let's make sure it's only if event.key is equal to arrow down. This is moving us down. I did do some research and figured out that in Internet Explorer, the arrow keys are actually just left, right, up, and down instead of arrow left, arrow down. So we could account for that as well. We would just need to do if event.key equals arrow down, or event.key or e.key equals down. Then we'll run this code where we're adding to the top. So adding more pixels to the top moves us down. Let's get the other direction going. So else if event.key equals arrow up, or e.key equals up for Internet Explorer and Edge. We'll do something similar, and we can refactor this later. We'll just do some very explicit long code. We'll get the current top, and then we'll set the avatar.style.top to just subtract 50 pixels. Let's test it out. Refresh. So I'm going to hit down. I'll hit up. I'll hit right, nothing happens, left, nothing happens. So that's working pretty well. There's one issue with the workaround I added in for the very first time we press the key. I'm going to hit down. We actually move up. And that's happening because my initial style for the top is 100 pixels, and then left is 10 pixels. So I could either go to my app.js and change this. Instead of returning 0, we could return 100. So we're matching what the current top is. And let's see if that works. So I'm going to hit down. There we go. So we don't have that issue anymore. Okay, so we've got up and down. Now how about left and right? Well, it's the same idea, but we're going to have to change it up just a tiny bit. So let's duplicate our else if. And let's do if the user hits the, let's do the right arrow. So right arrow, or if key equals right for those Windows browsers or Microsoft browsers. We don't want the top. We'll get the current left. And we want to extract that number from avatar.style.left. And then this is going to be annoying again. We're returning 100. Why don't I just say the original left is also 100, so we're in sync. And then we'll set avatar.style.left equals current left plus 50. And then one more. We want an else if. We don't want an else, because we have a million other keys that could be triggering this. We only want this group of 4, so else is not what we want. This will be a left arrow, and we'll check if it equals left. And then we'll do current left, that's the same. We'll just subtract, and we'll cross our fingers. Let's see. So I'm going to hit the right arrow and the left arrow. It's not working. So what's going on? Event.key equals, well, that was one of the dumber things I've ever done. That's a complete lie. I've done far dumber things, but this was very silly. Hopefully you caught it before me. Arrow down, arrow up. This needs to be arrow right, not right arrow. And then same thing here. We need arrow left. All right, let's try again. Hey, I can move. I can go down, I can go up. All right. So one fun thing we can do is make it so that when we're moving to the left, our image is facing to the left. And to do that, I can just show you here. If we do image.style, I have it selected, .transform, and we set scale to be -1, 1. Oh, image is not defined. Ugh, that should have been avatar. Try that again. We're now facing left. So we've scaled the image on the x-axis. If we pass -1, it basically flips the image. And then to go back the other way, we would just go scale 1, 1. So we could just copy this. And when you're moving to the right, well, let's start with the left. When you move to the left, we'll set avatar.style.transform to be scale of -1, 1. And then when you move back to the right next time, we'll go back to 1, 1. Refresh. I'll go down to the right, stay the same. Left, we're now facing the correct direction. So obviously this movement kind of sucks. It's based off of having to press the key over and over and over. If I just hold one of the arrow keys, it's not going to do it for me. And that's okay. This is not really how you would build a game for the most part. I mean, this could be a little demo, but you would use Canvas. You would use some library to help you out with physics, where you had coordinates. It's a lot easier, but this is a good enough demo. So why don't we figure out now how to move the coin to a random place on the page, and then when you touch that coin, we'll move the coin again. So to move the coin, why don't we just make a function to do that? We'll call it const move coin equals, we don't need any arguments. I guess we could pass in the thing we're trying to move, but we'll just do move coin. We'll select the coin. Do I have it selected? No. So const coin, and I think I'm going to select this up top with our avatar, equals document.querySelector with the ID of coin. Then down here, we'll want to pick a random position to move that coin to, and then move that coin to it using top and left. So we'll pick some random numbers based off of window.innerHeight, which we saw sometime in this course already, a couple videos ago. If I call window.innerHeight, or let's do inner width, it tells me I have 928 pixels available. I shrink that down more and call it again. Now it's 175. So we don't want to move the coin somewhere way off the screen if the window is not large enough, because you could have a large screen. We don't want to do, what is it, body window.screen. We don't want to use this because this is the available width for the window. On my monitor, it's 1920, but I might only have 100 something pixels available. So we'll use those, window.innerHeight, and I'll do a math.random. We'll multiply it by window.innerHeight, and I'll floor that so we get a whole number. And we'll save that to a variable called, if we're doing height, we'll call that y, and then duplicate it. Make another variable called x, math.random, window.innerWidth. So we have those two variables. Now I want to take the coin and do coin.style.top equals, and then I'll do a string, or we don't even have to do a query string. We could use concatenation and just plus sign pixels at the end, but I'll do a string template literal. So for the top, we want y. This is based off of the height. So height px. And then for the left, we'll do x px. And let's just try calling move coin from over here. So move, let me make some more space here. Move coin. Let's see if it works, and it appears to be working. Okay, so we're moving the coin around. I'm sure, it's not perfect. Our logic may end up moving it off the screen at some point, but it's simple enough for now. So that moves the coin. Now all that's left to do is to initially move the coin at the beginning when our code runs. So we can just put that somewhere, maybe put our function definitions. So we could just call that early on. So we could just execute that and move coin at the beginning so that when you refresh the page, the coin is somewhere else. And then we'll move to try and go get it, and nothing's going to happen. So the last thing to do is figure out when we've collided, which I've thankfully given us a nice helper function that computes that. It's called isTouching. And all we do here inside of this event listener, after we've moved the avatar, if necessary, we can just check if we want to check is touching that function that I gave you. We'll pass in the avatar and the coin. And if that's the case, we'll just call move coin again. So if this returns true, we pass in two items. It returns true if they are touching. Then we'll call move coin. Let's try it. Okay, so far, is touching has been called a couple of times, but we're not actually touching it. But there we go. It moved. Let's try again. And it appears to be working. So very, very entertaining game. But it's kind of fun. It's a little demo here. And we got that fancy change of direction. We're halfway to like a very basic game, except we don't have anything fun. All right. So if you wanted to, you could definitely refactor this a bit with the arrow down, arrow up, arrow right, arrow left. You could consider making an object to hold the different functions to call. You could make a function called move left, move right, move up, move down. That could be kind of fun. So here's one option. I'd make a couple different functions called move up, or we could even just call this move vertical. And then we'll take the thing, so we'll call it element, and then the amount. And what am I doing? I want this to be an arrow function, so we'll do that. And we would call this, for example, here, if we're trying to move down, we would do move vertical, pass in our element that had moved. Let's just go with avatar, and then positive 50. And then here to move up, we could pass in negative 50. And we would basically move this logic in here. So for move vertical, we're going to do, instead of avatar, we'll do element, which is the parameter name. So this could work for any element that we're passing in, not just the avatar. Element.style.top, and then set element.style.top to be current top plus amount. And the moment of truth, let's try deleting that. Let's see if up and down still work. It looks like they still work. So let's do the same thing. We'll make another function called move horizontal. And you could make one to handle all of this, but I think this will help keep them a little shorter and easier to understand if you're looking over the code. So here we want current left equals extract element.style.left. Element.style.left equals cur left plus amount. And then we'll just call it. If we're moving to the right, we want to add 50. We'll pass an avatar, make sure we're calling move horizontal. And then the same thing for the left, except we'll do minus 50. Okay, let's try it. It still works. Oh, except I deleted that one part where we flipped our avatar. So I guess I'll undo that for a moment. I got too eager there. We'll do it like this. So move horizontal, avatar, negative 50, and then set the scale to -1, 1. Here, we'll set it back to 1, 1. Does it work now? To the right, to the left, down, up. Awesome. And if we touch the coin, finally, pursuit of money. Have to keep going. Maybe more money. Maybe I'll be happier now. Nope. How about over here? I think this is the one. If I just make a little bit more, get that treasure. Oh man. All right, next time. Awesome. So if you want some extra features that you could add, definitely one would be a score count or a score keeper, just a little chart up top, or even just a paragraph in H1 that tells you how many times you've collected this. Also, you could create a whole bunch of coins, different values. Give them a different color. You could do that with a CSS filter. You can make some of the coins larger to make them worth 5. You could also have the coins move if you wanted to get fancier. But if you're going to do a bunch of animations, I would look into Canvas to make something a little bit more, or a lot more performant. All right, so that was mainly just about the arrow keys, but I thought it'd be fun to put something together where we're using a lot of the stuff we've seen. Events, we're talking about selecting, we're talking about style properties, creating elements. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about using forms. So we saw how we could use the key down, key press, key up events to run some code when a user types in a single input. But what if we want to do something when a user submits an entire form? So let's start with a simple form that we'll add in. Let's do a couple different inputs. We'll have an input type equals text. What should we do for this one? Let's go with placeholder equals credit card number. Sure, this is not going to be a real credit card form. We'll do another input. This one will be type equals, let's do a checkbox. And let's put a label around it. So I'll move it inside the label. I don't need a for if I'm embedding my input inside the label. I'll put some text in here. Let's do a checkbox. I agree to sell my soul to your company. And we don't need a placeholder for a checkbox. Let's also do, how about a select? A select where we have different options. If you're not super familiar with a select, it's how you can get a drop-down menu, basically. So why don't we pick, options. We'll just do something boring. Let's do vegetables, eggplant, and asparagus, and carrot. All right, so I'll put corresponding values, and we'll do eggplant there. Okay, so we have a couple different inputs now. And I'll also add in a button to submit this. Input type equals submit. And let's see what we end up with when I open it up here. kind of an ugly form, but we have a couple different inputs. We've got a select, we've got a checkbox, and we have our credit card input, which is just a text input, no validations, and then our submit. Now, if you're familiar with forms, you'll know what happens when I click submit. The page refreshes. A form is made to take data that we get from an input and submit it or send it somewhere. Traditionally, we would submit our data to some URL like /signup. So this would be an endpoint on our own server. The data would be sent to /signup, and then on our server side, we would do something, create a new user in the database, and then respond with a new page that would load. And so you would end up going to a completely new page. But with JavaScript and the rise of single-page apps and things like React and Angular and Vue or just vanilla JS, we can work with forms in a slightly different way. What we'll do is submit the form, or when it's submitted, we'll intercept it and say, don't send that request, don't refresh the page. Just to show you right now, if I submit this, I have to refresh to get that new attribute. If I submit this right now, it takes me to /signup, which doesn't exist. So what we'll do with JavaScript is take the form, when it's submitted, we'll say stop, don't actually send a request, don't take us anywhere else. I just want to capture that event. I want to trigger some JavaScript code when the user submits the form. Then we can extract the information we want and do something with it. Whether it's simply to display it back to the user, whatever we're doing here, or maybe we'll send the data to a database somewhere, to a server, but we won't actually refresh the page. We'll do it using JavaScript on the same page we're currently on. And we could maintain a single page application. So we're not really at the point where we're sending requests right now, but you'll see where we could easily add that in. So there is a form event called submit. You could attach an on submit, which I don't recommend doing. With any of those on events, those properties are just not ideal. But in our JavaScript, if we select our form, let's call this sign up form as the ID, and then select it. So document.querySelector, the ID sign, and then sign up form. Save that to a variable. We can add in a form.add event listener for the submit event. And we'll use the event object. Why don't I start by alerting submitted the form? And let's see what happens. So I'll refresh my page, click submit. Okay, so we get that event triggering, but then our page reloads. I don't know if you can tell that. If I go back to what I had before, where I gave it an action equals /no, let's do that, and we'll do method equals get. This is a traditional form. If I submit it now, we get our alert from the event handler, but then it still continues on. It does what it did earlier. It takes me to a different page. So we are capturing that event. We're doing something when that event is triggered, but we're not preventing the typical form behavior. And if I want to capture the data, but not go to a new page and not send a request, we have a way of doing it. There's a method on the event object. It's called prevent default. So E, if I'm calling my event object E, dot prevent default. And what this will do when we execute it is prevent the default behavior. And the default behavior in this case, with a form, when it's submitted, is to continue sending on your data, sending a request to whatever URL we specified. In our case, /no as a GET request. So now if we try it, let's see if it works. I click submit, we get the alert, and we don't go anywhere. Our form has not actually submitted. The submit event has run, but we haven't actually submitted data anywhere. And this leaves us free to now extract data if we wanted to get all the data at once and send it to an API using AJAX, using a client-side request. Again, something we haven't learned yet, but the point is we have the flexibility to do something with the data, and we can still capture the submit event. And what's nice about doing it this way, as opposed to capturing each input as it changes every single time, like we could have a key down or a key press on here, and anytime this input changes, we could create a variable in our JavaScript that is in sync with that. And anytime you select a different option, we could immediately update that variable or a second variable. but that means attaching a bunch of event listeners. We need to attach one here, one to the checkbox, one here, and then one for the submission as well. But by adding a submit event listener, there's just one event we're waiting for. We tell it not to behave the way it normally behaves, and then we can extract our data in here. So why don't we take a look at the event object for just a moment. I'll open up my console. We'll click submit. Let's put some data right there. Let's select caret, submit. We get our alert. Here's the event. Notice it has type set to submit. And then we have the target here. Target is the form that was submitted. And we also have this property called default prevented, which is set to true because we did prevent default. Alrighty, now that we have the submit event and we're preventing default, let's extract the data from the form and do something kind of trivial with it. So to extract the data, we need to be able to select the individual elements. So we've got an input, another input with type equals checkbox, and then the select. So why don't we start with the text input? That one's easy enough. I'll select them all. So const, what do we call it? Credit card number. Let's go with credit card equals document dot query selector. And did we give IDs to these inputs? It will be easiest if we just do an ID. Let's do credit card or CC. For the checkbox, let's go with, I agree to sell my soul to your company. Terms check or something, or just terms. And for our select, let's go with ID of veggie. Okay. And then we'll go into our app.js. We'll select based off of that ID, credit card. We'll also select the other options. So we had credit card, then we had terms check, or what do we want to call that? Terms checkbox. Credit card input maybe, just to be more descriptive. And this was the ID of terms. And then we have the veggie select with the ID of veggie. So now we have our three inputs. What we would do in here is probably just access each one of those input values, although they do differ a little bit because we have a regular input, a text input. So why don't we console.log credit card input.value, and maybe we'll just add CC, comma, so we can see both of them, or so we can see what we're printing out. Then to get the checkbox, how do we get the value from a checkbox? Well, why don't we start with just doing terms checkbox. We'll print out terms. And then for the last one, we have veggie select. Veggie select. And then here we'll do veggie select dot value. Let's see what we get. So I'll refresh. Let's fill something out in here. Credit card number, just make up fake number. Then we'll do, let's do agree and go with asparagus. Submit. And here's what we have. Credit card, we got the value out correctly. For terms, we got on, which is the checkbox here. If I submit again, we still get on, even though it's not checked anymore. So value maybe isn't what we want to use. I'll show you the better attribute in just a moment, or the better property. And then veggie select, we did get asparagus. Notice we're getting the value we set. So it's eggplant with a capital E, but the value I gave as an attribute was eggplant lowercase e. So this is what we're getting. We're not getting this here. And if we go back to our app.js, instead of printing out terms checkbox.value, there is a property called checked on inputs with type equaled check, or type equal to check. And it's a Boolean property. So we've got false. Now we've got true. Cool. So we have our data. We could put it in variables. I won't spend too much time here doing that because it really just depends on what you're trying to do with it. But we have access to the data from that form. But the point here is that we can prevent default from a form submission, and then tap into the form or to the inputs, get the values we want, and then do something else. We could send form data to database or append something to page using form data. It's totally up to you, but the process looks like this. We have a submit event on a form. We prevent the default, which I like to put up top just so it's clear. you can see it's still working the way we had it written, but it makes it very obvious what we're doing. First, we're stopping default submission behavior for a form, and then we're extracting the information we want. Next up, two very similar events that are pretty useful. They're called input and change. On input, on change are the respective properties. They have to do with inputs like we have here, a text input, a select, a checkbox. And what I want to show you is that we can actually listen to changes across all three of these different types of inputs or different form controls using a single event type. And our goal here is to, let's say, create a data structure that looks like this. It's an object that will automatically stay in sync or will stay updated with whatever a user is typing. So instead of waiting for a user to hit submit, like we did in the previous video, where we grab the data from each input after they submit the form, we could instead just keep in sync and know exactly what is happening in each input. So we would have an object with maybe a key of credit card, and it would be equal to whatever is in that input. We could have the checkbox, so terms, and then that could be set to true, and veggie could be set to caret. And then as soon as one of these changes, if the user checks the checkbox, we want it to go to false immediately. We don't want to wait for a submission event. So to do this, we can use the input event. The type of the event is called input. I'll show it to you now. We'll do add event listener, input, and then we'll do an arrow function this time. Let's console.log let's start with credit card changed, and then we'll print out the event. I'll refresh, and you'll see as soon as I change this input here, anything, which is basically whenever I type a character in here, we get a new console.log. So the input has changed. We also have input.target, which tells me what the input actually is, or what triggered this event, what the object is. And if I wanted to create this data structure, I could have const form data, set it equal to an object, and then update form data of, let's go with credit card, maybe all lowercase cc, equals, and then to get the value, it's event.target.value, which is the target element, the input itself. Scroll down, we'll see the value. Where are you? V. Keep going. Got carpal tunnel already from that scrolling. Here we go. That's the value. Or I could have just hard coded it as credit card input dot value. But I'm going to go with event.target.value because you'll see in just a moment that we could actually refactor this into a single callback. So I'll type something in here. Let's look at our form data, and it's up to date. Now we could do the same thing, duplicate this for the veggie select. So veggie select dot add event listener for the input event, which will trigger whenever we change the value of that select. So instead of credit card changed, we'll say veggie changed. And let's add to form data under the key veggie. So I'll change this value, and we get our console.log. If I look at my form data object, it has veggie of caret, but as soon as I type something in here, we look at form data. Now it has the credit card value from that input, and it has the selected veggie. So it's staying up to sync. Staying up to date or in sync with what we have. And we can do one more for the checkbox, which is a little bit trickier. Not really, but we can't use the value. We'll use the checked attribute or the checked property. Terms checkbox.add event listener input event, and we'll do console.log checkbox, and then we'll print the event. And for form data, if we want to update the form data, let's go with agree to terms maybe, and set that equal to event.target. We can't do value because it's a checkbox. We do checked, which we saw very recently. So let's try it. I check it. Let's look at form data. Agree to terms is true. I change this. We'll look at form data. Veggie is caret. I type something in here. We look at form data again. And there we go. It's staying up to date. So now we have this object that is staying in sync with whatever is going on in the form, so we don't have to wait for a user to click submit. We could wait for them to submit to send the data off or to do something with the data, but we have a live representation. Well, it's not live, but a in-sync representation of what's in the form. And this is how we could achieve something like this credit card form from CodePen. As I type, the numbers are updating up top, although they're also being obfuscated, so they're not fully showing, but whatever I type is being affected and displayed live, so it's not waiting for me to submit. And I'll add in a cardholder name. That's updating up there. I can put in the security code, and that's showing on the back. It's a pretty cool form, but what I'm trying to illustrate here is that these events are all being triggered before a user submits. The JavaScript knows what's going on in these inputs as I type, which is what we have here. It's just, there's no functionality and nothing pretty to look at, but we're doing the same thing. So I did mention there's a better way of writing this. This is 3 separate event listeners, which is fine. We need to attach an event listener to each one. What is not great is that we're hard coding these in. It would be nice if we could have one where I could say something like, in the event listener or in the callback, where I could figure out which input we were working with, take that input, get its value, and then just store that in the form data dynamically, which we can do. And here is the simplest way of doing that. I'll comment these out so we have them. We'll add a name to each input. So the first one will have maybe credit card as a name. The second one will have a name of agree to terms. And the third one will have a name of selected veggie. Okay, so we have 3 names. Now in our JavaScript, we can loop over all 3 of these. So I'll make an array with credit card input, terms, checkbox, and veggie select. And I'll loop over that for let input of, and then I'll do an input.addEventListener for the input event. We have our event here, an arrow function, and on this event object, we have event.target, which we've already seen. There's a property called name. So why don't I console.log that? We'll try running it. When this changes, selected veggie was the name. Here, agree to terms was the name. Here, credit card is the name. So we can use that name to add to our form data object. So it would be something like this: form data of event.target.name equals event.target.value. We're taking whatever that value is and adding it in under the name that is on the input. There's still a minor problem because our checkbox doesn't have the value we want it to have. But if I do asparagus, change my credit card number to LOL, we'll look at form data over here. And look at that. Selected veggie is asparagus, credit card is LOLOL, and I didn't have to actually reference any of those manually. So I could have 10 different inputs, and automatically, as long as I give them a name, their input value will be added to my object under their name. Now, as far as the checkbox, this one's kind of annoying. Unfortunately, there is no value on a checkbox. It's just set to on. Whether it's on or off, we still get on, which is pretty obnoxious. But we can write a little bit of an edge case into this function where we can check if the type of the input is a checkbox. So if we console.log e, refresh my page, I'll check this. If we look at event.target, scroll way down, every input here has type of checkbox. Not every input, but every input has a type. In this case, it's a checkbox. Here, if I do the text input, which is for credit card, and we take a look, where are you? Target, scroll down, we can find type. It's set to text. So we could write a little bit of a conditional to check what type is equal to. And what I would probably do is destructure target. That's the only thing we care about from the event. So use a parameterized destructuring. I don't even know if that's the right term for that, but destructure in the parameter definition. And then I'll destructure even more. I'll grab the name, I'll grab the type, the value, and the checked property out of target, which is event.target. And then I can update this to be form data of name equals event.target.value. But I want to check first if type is equal to checkbox. If that's the case, then we'll store the value of checked. Otherwise, we store value. So this is kind of a maybe hacky one-liner, but we're taking the name, whatever the name is, credit card input, or credit card, I think is what we went with. And then we have a type, which should be set to text for that input. We have a value, which is whatever's in the input, and checked won't exist for that input because it's not a checkbox. So then we're taking form data, we're updating the property credit card, which is the name, and we're checking if type is equal to checkbox. It's not, so we'll use the value. But then if we change the checkbox, checked will have a value, true or false, and type will be checkbox. So this is true, and we'll store the Boolean true or false from checked. So let's console.log form data here. Extra S, refresh. I'll check it. Agree to terms true. Check again, false. Now we have selected veggie is carrot. Type something in here. It's updating automatically, which is pretty cool. We have one function, one callback that we are using, and it's working on 3 different inputs. And I could have more. If I had 4, 5, 10 different inputs here, I could use this same code if all I wanted to do was create an object containing the form data. The last thing is that I mentioned we have input and change, 2 different events. If I just switch this over to be a change event, it will still work pretty much the same way. We've got selected veggie, asparagus. This is updating, but here, this won't update until I lose focus. So I just clicked away, or if I hit enter. So just typing in the input doesn't trigger that event, but focusing or losing focus, which is called blurring the input, or hitting enter will change it. Otherwise, these 2 are the same. You can't really incrementally change the checkbox or the select. It's just yes or no. But with a text input, there is a difference between the change event and the input event that we had earlier. So input will just always update. Whenever this updates or whenever the input itself has any new characters in there, it triggers the event. All right, so 2 different events and a new pattern. This is pretty common, especially if you get to something like React and some of these other frameworks out there and other libraries. You'll see code kind of like this, where we use the name of an input as a key to store the value from that input under to create a nice object that contains all of our form data at once.